Hi, I'm Chris Wilson. So, this is the interview that people have been requesting for some time. Today, I'll be chatting with Jonathan Rogers. The context for viewers is Jonathan and I were two of the co founders of Grinding Gear Games and ran the company together for 17 years or so. I left a few years ago, and Jonathan's been running it since then. So, for every new Path of Exile 2 release the company does, they run a press tour where journalists and influencers can interview the company about the new expansion. And now that I've got my YouTube channel, I kind of snuck onto the press tour and snagged an interview slot with Jonathan. Hey, Jonathan, how are you going?
Hey, I'm going good.
Nice, good to talk to you. Yeah, so how's life at GGG? 050 is looking really cool. I'm very, very pleased to see it.
Well, it's certainly busy, I'll tell you that. Like, there's a lot going on. Like 050 is kind of this just like giant patch that, is like a crazy bear to organize just because there's so many different parts to it. So, yeah, it's certainly probably one of the harder ones I've ever worked on, I'd say.
The scope looks crazy. Like, when you were initially telling me about it, like, obviously there's a ton of stuff in the end game, but you just kept going.
Yeah. I think one of the issues, one of the perils of being in early access is there's this kind of desire of like, okay, with every patch, we want to try and fix everything. Like, we want to try and get the game into a state where it's more releasable. And so then we're like, okay, the end game is a problem. We need to address it. So we're like, okay, what are the things that would need to happen? What are all the things that would need to happen in order to make the end game good? And so suddenly then you're ending up with the scope that's just absolutely gigantic. And probably the smart thing to do would be to be, okay, we're just going to divide this up into like several pieces, and then we're going to go and we're going to try and do each one, and one at a time. But the problem is, it's really... What was that, sorry?
Oh, could you divide the endgame stuff? Like, it feels to me like you kind of do need to do that pretty cohesively.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, right? Like, it does feel like you can't divide it, and that's because you're like, okay, if we're going to make the endgame good, it means that every single, like, all of the things in it need to be good and so on. But like, the reality is that probably what would have been better is like, hey, just leave one of these leagues bad, and just like concentrate on the others and everything like that. But I really didn't want to. So what we ended up doing was kind of like, okay, we're gonna make every single thing that's in the end game actually good. Like, we're gonna make sure that they all have the sort of depth of a full like league system. We're not gonna leave it like how it was in 010 and that kind of thing. And that's just kind of led to the scope being huge. And we were planning even 040 to have a bunch of the end game stuff, and then it ended up just getting pushed because it was just kind of too huge. So yeah, it's just a scope management issue, and it's been pretty difficult.
So, with regard to that delay there, how did the thought process work? Like, obviously, you'd worked out a scope of in-game stuff in your head you thought you could do for 040, and then the reality was you eventually had to decide to push it. But, like, what was it that made it too big to do in 040?
Well, once again, I think it was probably just the fact that we wanted to do it all at the same time. So we were like, okay, we need 4 new pinnacle bosses because we need to be, we're upgrading 4 leagues. And if we've got 4 new pinnacle bosses, we need, like, here's all the stuff that needs to do. We need to make sure the league mechanics have like an extra thing going on with each of them, like all that sort of stuff. And I think if we'd just done one of them in 040, that would have been absolutely fine, and we could have got extra, especially because like a bunch of work was done, right? Like, there was a bunch of work done before 040 because we did think that the endgame stuff was going to go in, which then we kind of had to at the last minute be like, okay, we actually can't do this. It's just going to have to be the druid in the league effectively for 040. So yeah, that was kind of a bit annoying because it made 040 feel a lot smaller. And it's interesting because like 030 was obviously a huge, like a huge release. And then 040 kind of felt like a bit of a letdown by comparison. It really is just because a bunch of work that was done didn't end up shipping in it. So 050, though, on the other hand, is going to feel like this absolutely gigantic release because a bunch of work that was done for 040 which didn't make it is now going to be in it, plus a bunch of extra stuff as well. So yeah, that's kind of just one of those things, I guess. But yeah, it's sort of surprising as well because the larger something is, it honestly, like, the time taken to do it seems to go up by more than linearly, right? Like, if you do something twice as big, it takes more than twice as long to do it. So that's one of the tricky things we've certainly found.
Yeah. I noticed, so this early access you're running for PoE2 at the moment, it's not the first time GGG did early access. Like, as you recall, we did it for 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0 back, like the Awakening and Fall of Oriath and so on. But those were way shorter. Like, it was basically like 1 league's worth. And obviously you guys will have run this for like a year or so. And in fact, is it a year or 2 years?
It'll be 2 years,
yeah.
By the time we're done, I suspect.
Yep. So the question I have here is, this means that you're having to run early access, not just as a beta test, but kind of as a live service. Like, you're having to, when you do an update, you can't say, hey guys, please test the campaign. There is no end game, because they want to play the end game. You want them to be playing it as a final product. It makes money and so on. So is it hard managing a live service when what you kind of want is testing of specific features?
It honestly really is. And the funny thing about it is that we never intended, as I'm sure you specifically know, to
Mm.
have early access last this long. Like both of us were very optimistically thinking, oh, yeah, it's going to be 6 months. But the
That was
reality
the
was
plan.
that
Yep.
it was way, way longer than that. Yeah, the funny thing is that I think that when you haven't made a game from scratch for a while, even if you're sitting there churning out League launches, it honestly took me by surprise how much work there is in it.
Mm.
Which I mean, we did it before, but yet it's like somehow you forget like how much there actually is there. And I mean, the first time we did it, we took like was it 6 years or something?
Yeah.
And like before we actually uh, released anything. And then it was quite a long while after that before we had more than a couple of acts.
Mm.
Like all the rest of it and everything. So like, that was actually kind of, yeah, PoE2 just ended up being a sort of similar prospect, but it didn't seem like that because it's like, you kind of look at it and you're like, well, the team's so much larger. There's so much more going on. Like we've made all this, there's all this pre-production stuff. We've like made tons of monsters. We've made tons of unique art. We've made all this stuff. It's like, it feels like the putting it together part at the end should be somehow not as long as it is. And yet somehow it just ended up being way bigger. So I think that's been kind of the sort of pretty brutal wake up call.
Mm.
Is you think you know how to make a game and then you do it again and it's like, oh yeah, that's right. A decade later, it's actually really, really hard still.
I wonder if this is because some percentage of each release has to go into like league stuff and micros and other novel stuff for that release, and it gives you less than 100% of the time to like it slows down the development of act content and that kind of
Well,
stuff.
the early access stuff is very much like that. And that in particular is part of the reason why we're not doing a 060. So, like 050 is going to be the last release. And the reality is that we're kind of like, okay, getting Act 5 and 6 and all the stuff we've got in 1.0 out, it can't be done in 4 months.
Mm.
We can do it in 8 months, but if we don't do it in 4 months, we have to do another league. And if we do another league, then that's even more content we have to make because it's a league now, right? And so that would actually push 1.0 out even further. And so you've got this thing where it's like every single launch is effectively stealing resources from finishing the game.
Yeah.
So at some point we just had to sort of put our foot in the sand and say, no, we're actually going to get this damn game out now if it does mean going a little bit longer between two releases. So it'll be really good though, because once we get to 1.0, like not having to have this like extra giant thing going on in the backdrop of finishing the campaign and so on is just going to be so much easier. Like the idea of just being able to make a league rather than have to also like do like mega revamps of everything and like just crazy like new campaign acts and everything is going to be pretty good. I think it's going to like allow us to relax a little bit more compared to what we have been doing, because the rush to 1.0 has been pretty crazy.
One thing that you and I had done previously, like a long time ago, is we'd often be working on the next league, but have the beginnings of a larger league. Like I remember with Ascendancy, for example, when we started work on that. I mean, that's partly because we overscoped or underestimated it, but we essentially moved Ascendancy from its slot to the next slot and did another league instead. Obviously, you guys, like I know GGG won't have plans that far out for the future because you're focusing all on 1.0. But do you expect that you would intermingle larger releases and larger leagues?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, you need to have updates that like shake up the end game and do other stuff like that every now and then. Otherwise, things will get scale. So we'll absolutely be doing the whole like AB kind of like thing that we used to do. It's just at the moment, effectively, what you've got going on in the background is that the B, as it were, is like the extra act that you're sitting there working on, because there's like a ton of work that's going on there in the background. Yeah, like we'll probably do that. I mean, look, it's funnily enough, right? Because sometimes the like latency times get so crazy that there are like things being made for 1.2 already in the pipeline. Like it's like we know there's certain bosses that we need and stuff like that, and we're like, okay, sometime around 1.2 we're probably going to need this, so let's get it started into the pipeline now. So there's certainly some longer things like that.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we're like, okay, I mean, as I'm once again, I'm sure you'll probably remember, we're like, okay, the league that's after Christmas is never going to be the big one that has the thing, so therefore the 1.2 therefore has to be the one, and like you pretty much that's how you sort of end up with that stuff.
That's amazing. Like this may just be like a conspiracy theory I had back when I was trying to work on league planning stuff, but it always felt that the league around September was small because like my blame at the time was like, northern hemisphere people going back to school or whatever, and there was
Mm-hmm.
always this dip. Like I remember Delve, one of our best leagues we ever made by
Mm-hmm.
far, just having such a big dip. It was like quiet and no one seemed to care at the time, and I thought, well, that's the September curse. And then you've got the January, February, March curse where you've made it over Christmas, as you say.
Yeah.
And then you've also got like a new seasonal game coming out every week because there's going to be a Diablo 4 season and a Diablo 3 season and a Diablo 2 season and a Diablo 2 Resurrected season and World of Warcraft Classic and World of Warcraft season of whatever they've got going on and Last Epoch. And how do you like, and then there's the GTA 6 release, right? Which is just a crater where that happens. Like how do you time all of this stuff these days with so much going on?
Well, I have to say, we usually don't pay too much attention to the other ARPG releases because we honestly couldn't. And honestly, the community would slay us if they thought that we were delaying things just because some other game had a thing coming out. That being said, like, GTA 6 is a bit of a problem. Like, if there's a release you're going to avoid, I would say that's the one. But thankfully, since they're not on PC, then it's like not as big of a thing. But the thing is, they're going to buy out like literally all the media, like all the things will be that, like anything that it's possible to spend money on, I'm sure they'll be spending it on. So probably not a good idea, even just for that reason alone, to launch like on the same weekend as them, I would say.
Well, but, I mean, GGG always had the David versus Goliath thing going on, right? So why not take on Rockstar?
That's a Goliath I don't want to take on, quite frankly. Like that's the that one's kind of big. But yeah, I mean, just generally speaking, in terms of other ARPGs and stuff, I mean, look, I wouldn't launch on someone else's release day intentionally, but if there's other constraints around, I'm certainly not going to shy away from it just because like we've got our own thing going, we've got our own audience, like we can deal with it. It's just been a bit unfortunate recently how often that's occurred, like seemingly randomly. So I don't know if someone else is doing that intentionally or not. But, yeah.
So there are kind of two strategies for scoping release dates and content, right? One of them is we fix a date and then release with the content that's available, which isn't easy if the content has to be a certain size, like a league, for example. You don't want to release with a half-finished league and say, that's what we have. And then, of course, the other approach is, take your time to get it right and release it without a degree of predictability. Once the dust has settled on 1.0 and you're going forward with the plan and resources and so on, which do you expect you'll be doing? Like, how are you going to have a rigid schedule? Or
well, it's definitely fix the date and have the content move, but there's always has to be a little bit of like sometimes you can't necessarily change the scope easily as you get towards the actual release date because what you'd have to cut will either be so large that it completely undercuts the release, or there's just like no like place you can sort of pick at it to easily pull it apart. So sometimes you do end up with sort of like 1 week delays around that sort of stuff. And this last one we did, so I mean, like that was even our intention, like during PoE 2's early access, and like we've actually improved that a lot recently with like PoE 1's definitely successfully back on that train again, and PoE 2 sort of mostly is. What's been tricky though is just that with an example of the whole thing of having one thing that's too big in scope and therefore you can't sort of do anything but delay is all this endgame stuff where it's like, because we want to do it in one big package, it's then becomes something where it's like, you don't want to cut one league because then it sort of undercuts the whole message. So like that's the kind of stuff that's been really difficult in that. But we certainly strive for just like cut stuff until the deadline works, because people really do actually prefer the regular updates, and you don't want to disappear into a hole and just work on something forever either. Like I think I said it earlier, but like it really is the case that the bigger the thing you're working on is, the more work it takes to make it at all. So I think that like having shorter release cycles and like releasing more often honestly produces more work rather than less. Like you really want to be just producing things on as fast a cadence as possible.
That you can get away with. That produces more aggregate entertainment hours as well, I suspect. More releases means more people coming back for more releases. And so
I guess so, but I wouldn't really think about it that way. Like it really is, I think, in terms of just being able to make content at a reasonable speed. Like it's sort of an interesting phenomenon where that I noticed of the team as well. Is like, so we had developers who were working on things to the they were working on PoE 2 for a long time before it was released, and then we had developers who were working on like leagues for PoE 1. And the people who'd been working on PoE 2 for a really long time, like they've gotten out of the habit of like actually like finishing things and getting it done, because like it kind of wasn't in a release. And it actually took a little bit of effort to sort of get people back on the train again of like, oh yeah, that's right, we have to actually ship things quickly. Like it actually is quite difficult. And I honestly feel like a lot of the reason why a lot of larger games fail is just because they're not shipping fast enough. Like, you can probably make a game better in less time, I actually believe, compared to what you get in a long time. Like, there's something really focusing of just like having a deadline that's relatively close by.
So one of the issues that I felt when working on these leagues, like this happened like 35 times and you were sitting right there alongside me every time, was just that things ended up coming in hot every time, right? Like we're still working on stuff. Like there's the story about how I remember vividly sitting next to you at midnight on Synthesis release day and saying, hey, Jonathan, we still have to like check that you're happy with how the tile generation works for Synthesis. And you saying, oh yeah, we should do that.
I remember now, yeah.
And you rewrote it with 3 hours to go to release, basically. And
that was a good one. It was much better afterwards. So I was pretty happy with that rewrite.
My responsibility there was making sure we picked the safe option, and the safe option was you rewriting it in 45 minutes.
The thing is the much worse one that you probably wouldn't appreciate was we rewrote quite a significant portion of the database backend literally the night before shipping 010 for PoE2.
But it made it better.
There was things like we realized something about the load testing. We were like, oh, we never tested this thing, and then we changed something about the load testing, and the whole thing just falls over. And we're like, crap, this is like a very big problem. We'll call this stuff tomorrow. And then we came up with some pretty ridiculous ideas on how to improve that. And like someone on our team literally rewrote all the saving. Like they added compression to character saves as like a last ditch thing. Like bear in mind, we're like hours before release, and it's like, okay, look, how about we try this? This is like this is a pretty crazy one. So yes, I'm certainly no stranger to that kind of thing happening from time to time.
Yeah, compression on saves is a good idea because that can take place on the instance, right? And there's a lot of stuff in there, like the waypoint list and so on.
Yeah, made them way smaller. That's the particular reason for needing that, by the way, is because once the size of a character gets above a certain size, it becomes larger than what's called a database page. And once it's larger than that, the performance gets really bad. So the PoE2 characters, as it turned out, were just larger than the PoE1 ones, and that's part of the reason why it wasn't the performance was just way worse.
So rather than me asking what compression you're getting, the important number here is what percentage of characters didn't fit in a page, and now what percentage do?
Before the test we were doing. In fact, I remember what the test was now. So the thing we did in the test is all the characters that we had were not in late in the game. They were all like. They had a lot of items and stuff like that in the load test we were doing, but they weren't like late in the game where they have way more quest flags. And so the quest flags sent them over the edge. So anyone who gets like past Act 3 or 4 or something was getting above the limit of what could fit in the database page.
Yeah. I can imagine the quest flags, they compress really well, I imagine.
Yeah, they do, exactly.
All zeros or all ones, right?
Yeah, we just added like a really I can't remember what compression it was, but like, it probably half the size of a character, but more importantly, it's below the threshold and now the performance is good again. So
yeah, that's cool. That's cool. So where I was going with me commenting that when I was there, we never had any time to really test stuff is how has that been? Is it still down to the wire with releases? Because I imagine it's hectic. Or have you managed to like has the console simultaneous deployment meant that you've got some breathing room for testing and stuff?
I would say it's getting better, but then on the other hand, it also isn't. Like it always feels hectic. And ultimately the reason for that is because if there's more time, people want to do more, right? Like people are always going to be like, okay, like I can squeeze in a couple more uniques, I can squeeze in this or that, right? So you end up with a situation where people the work always expands to fill the space that there is.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to actually.
Yeah, I felt my role there was saying no to people in the last 2 weeks, and
yeah, for sure.
Hopefully, you're keeping the no's coming.
Well, we try, but then on the other hand, maybe I'm not as good at it as you were.
Well, here's the key thing: being completely honest. When I was fully in charge of scope of something, it would end up smaller, like Sentinel. There was less in there. When you and Mark were involved, there were more yeses and more cool stuff was delivered. Obviously, I was petrified about the risk associated with there's so much extra stuff to test in the last minute, and maybe that led to more problems or something. But the releases where you guys got to decide scope had so much more interesting stuff coming because that extra 10% on top is where the special stuff is in PoE. And I never had the guts to do it myself.
Well, the tricky thing is that probably the coolest stuff is the stuff that comes in the latest because you get to build on top of the things that you already like built. Like you've got the actual systems working, and it's like now let's think of some cool stuff. And one thing I would say about 050 is there's just a lot of the like weird cool things Like you're like, okay, here's an ascendancy class, but look, there's a hidden node, and if you do this quest line, then you like commune with the dreamer, and then like it unlocks this modifies the class like slightly, so it's got this extra node in it, and just stuff like that. There's just lots of things like that.
Yeah.
Like there's like it's like here's this hidden passage in this one particular map, and if you walk past it with a specific item, then the rune will glow, and then if you walk up to it, the door opens, and then inside there's like a crafting bench, and then on that thing you can like take these things, and there's just the stuff like that, just like lots and lots of these little things.
That's cool.
So it's been kind of pretty fun having a lot of stuff like that. And honestly, I bet you that there's ones I don't even know about, because Mark will have his deceit features that he'll just sneak in like that I won't know about, which he does on purpose, by the way. So don't judge Jonathan about this random thing. But it's fine. So like there's just like lots of little cool things.
I strongly recommend not announcing or showing those. Of course, the temptation is it's more stuff to put on the live stream. But of course,
we'll show a couple of them, and I'll hint towards a couple of others. But like there'll be more that they won't have seen. Like there's quite a few.
So on the topic of the 10%, extra stuff that can go on top, one thing you and I tried a long, long time ago was to release a follow-up patch after a league launch, usually after a bad league launch, with extra stuff. And what we found at the time, at least my recollection of this, is that the players playing appreciated more content. Their Reddit comments would be a bit less angry because we've changed some stuff and fixed it, but it didn't bring players back. And so, in terms of changing the shape of the graph or the income being generated during the follow-up patch, the extra 10% after release had little benefit, apart from, good feelings. But I can imagine what you're saying here is by fitting that 10% into the release, everyone gets to benefit from it.
Yeah, well, you certainly want that. No, well, the thing you were saying there about like so when it comes to seasonal content like this, you really want to just concentrate as much as you can in the season as possible. However, there is a really important thing, which is that you don't want people to feel, the people who are playing, to feel sour about the league, because that will influence the results you get next season. So you do actually need to fix stuff and improve it. But it's really challenging, especially when the things that need fixing are actually nerfs. Then you've got like sort of the double-edged sword problem. So like there was things like this is actually a PoE1 example, but it's like, okay, we had some things where there were some mechanics with the Breach prequel that people weren't happy about. And so it was sort of really important to make sure that we'd got those sorted out by the time the next release comes along. Otherwise, it would just be a bunch of people complaining about that. So you do really need to make sure that you're at least improving all that stuff. But in terms of like adding more content, like more uniques or something, it's just not really going to matter, because it's like most people are kind of like wanting to go play the season, and then then they're done with it and they want to come back next season. So it doesn't end up really mattering too much about adding content. Like it doesn't juice numbers or anything.
Yeah.
And that's like interesting as well, because a lot of the wisdom from a lot of other game companies is that like, oh, you need to run a bunch of seasonal events. You need to do like all this sort of stuff. Like it's like a constant refrain that you get. Like if you look at the mobile game space, it's like they're like all about the events. Like it's just constantly like you have to do something every week or whatever to prevent people from leaving. But it's just not our MO at all. Like our goal is like give you a satisfying experience. They leave, you come back later.
Yeah.
And it's honestly the hardest thing to convince people of. And like even a lot of the time people believe they understand it, they still don't really. Like there's that talk that you did at GDC that people commonly reference where we talk about this quite a lot.
Yes.
And the funny thing is that like people will reference that and talk about it and link it to each other and all that sort of stuff. But yet when I talk to these people in person, I still feel like they still don't actually understand. They're still not really willing to commit what they would really need to commit to really do that. Like in particular, most people are incredibly petrified of economic resets. Like people just actually, most games just do not have the balls to actually reset people's progress. And yet I would say that it's like one of the major reasons why Path of Exile 1 still is going today. Like if we did not do that, I just don't think Path of Exile 1 could possibly have lasted as long as it did. So
it's a bit of a shock to the system to new players, but once they experience the joy of doing a league start and then the joy of doing another league start where it feels fair, then they're addicted.
It does take a little while to get into, because I mean, like you'll start, of course people will be, you get the whole thing, oh, we need to skip the campaign. Like people start to ask, oh, I don't want to have to do it again if I already did it and that kind of stuff. But it's like, it's really important that you don't, because it's so important that everyone feels like they're on a fair playing field. And it's like part of the reason why you still don't get new users at all. It's like Path of Exile 1 still gets new users today, not like a lot, but we do get them. And so like that's part of the reason why Path of Exile 1 is still good. And, I actually found out a metric recently that I'd never actually looked at specifically, or at least hadn't for a long time, which maybe you'd find interesting as well, which was that between the last two PoE 1 releases, even though they were approximately the same size, only 40% of the makeup of the next League launch was from the previous League launch.
Really? And
Yeah.
were those players from past ones, or they
Yes,
weren't
here's the
genuinely
thing. They
new, right?
weren't, most of the players weren't new players,
Mhm.
but yet only 40% of the people actually play from one league to the next. So what
Hmm.
I'm saying is that a huge amount of people are actually, they'll come back like 3 or 4 leagues later and try it again and that kind of stuff. Like there's actually a lot of that going on as well. So, you end up with a situation where for a PoE 1 launch, you might only get like 10 or 15% truly new players.
Hmm.
And then it's like 40% of people who played the last league, and then the rest of them are people who played like several leagues ago.
That's
So,
fascinating because
yeah, it's kind of
in the
interesting.
past we had efforts to enlist new players, marketing to new audiences. You had the
Mhm.
efforts to return the users from the last one, but there weren't necessarily we didn't have a strong way of reactivating people from past leagues.
Yeah.
And I wonder, are those users watching the live stream? Like when you announce new league, does everyone tune in and then they decide if they're playing or not, if they want to
So
make
I
the
have a
commitment?
feeling that is what it is. Like, and that's I think why it's sort of important to have a variety of different leagues with different like feels, because I think there are certain people who'll come back for
Mm,
certain things and not others, and that's just kind of fine. Like it's just sort of nice that you can do a variety like that. And yeah, like I guess you'll have some tentpole releases, right? Like Settlers was like a really huge one that like I think a larger than normal amount of people came back for, which is why it was so large. I mean, there was the whole thing about how PoE2's release was coming up, and there's like various other tailwinds that were good for it. But
yeah. Also,
um,
to bear in mind with Settlers, sorry to interrupt, but
mhm.
because that was one that you and Mark did, it was the 10% larger than the Chris ones, and so
Maybe,
it
but I
would
mean,
have
it just
stood out.
presented really well, and like
Yeah.
it was just a really good league like that. So I think a greater than usual number of people came back. But the reason why I was actually looking at this at all is because I was wondering, like I saw the number, what it was for PoE2, and I was kind of disappointed in it. And I was like, well, I should look at what the number is for PoE, like in terms of like people who went from 030 to 040. And then I was like, okay, but what was it? What is it for PoE1? And I found the PoE1 number was actually lower. And I was like,
Hmm.
okay, this seems like kind of strange. But as I said, I think it's just because PoE1's got such a large base of people who, like who come back every few leagues,
Yeah.
that that's the reason why it can be like that.
Yeah, I imagine for a very enfranchised player who knows the game backwards, they really want to play. If the release comes out and they're visiting their grandparents that weekend or something, and they kind of can't play as much as they'd
Sure,
like
sure.
to, they're like, "Sweet, I know there's another one in 3 or 4 months. I'll play then," and then
But
they
it
play
is
then.
also part of the thing of like running seasonal as opposed to ones where you're constantly running events, is that like, the downside, as it were, is that if you don't get people on that weekend, it's
Hmm.
quite unlikely to get them later either. So you're
Yeah.
putting all your eggs in one basket there. But I still think it's the superior strategy because there aren't really very many games that have lasted as long as PoE has. Um, like most of the other ones. In fact, like what is another PvE game that has lasted as long as PoE has? It's like they're actually incredibly rare. There's a few, I think,
World of
around.
Warcraft,
Yes, sure.
Eve Online, does that count as
That
PVE?
that game is such a like so far outside my understanding that I don't even know if I can qualify that one way or the other. Like that's like a sort of a completely incomprehensible to me. I have no idea what's going on with
I
Eve Online.
I
So
had a
yeah,
conversation with the Eve developers a long
yeah,
time ago, like
yeah.
7 years
Yeah.
ago, 10 years ago. And I'm sure they won't mind me mentioning this now because it's been so long. But the designers I spoke to had this concern that when they add content to EVE Online, the players expect it to be there forever. And therefore,
Mm-hmm,
they can't experiment with interesting stuff. And they
mm-hmm,
expressed direct jealousy with our leagues. We
mm-hmm.
could introduce something crazy. And then, worst case scenario is you break the game
Yeah,
because it was Harvest, right?
for sure. Well, we
Sorry.
do. The funny thing is that we do actually end up bringing most of what we put in back. We just get to tweak it along the way, so it
Yeah.
doesn't having to be a millstone around our neck for so long.
Yeah, my
So
rule of thumb was to have the league out, then to take it away for one league
yeah,
cycle
for one
for
league cycle,
sure.
and then bring back the one after.
Right, because then when you bring it back, it's okay to come back with changes.
Mm-hmm. But we don't always necessarily do that. It kind of comes down to a little bit of like what's going on. But I mean, the other thing as well is like, especially for the PoE2 content we're making, because we're sort of filling out the core. There's definitely expectation, all that stuff to stay around, which probably won't be the case post 1.0. Like after that point, it'll be like the leagues are kind of like temporary more explicitly.
Yeah.
Then we decide which ones we want to keep or not. But
Is like Rise of the Abyssal in the end game, for example? I can't remember.
yeah.
Makes sense.
So
Should be, yeah.
it's pretty cool actually in the new one, because now that we've got everything on the atlas, there's like giant abyss cracks that are like on the generated atlas.
Oh, that's cool.
And then you can close those by running maps along the lines. So it actually kind of works out being a similar mechanic to memory lines in PoE1, where you like run along a thing, except it's like a giant continent scale abyss crack, and then you're closing it one map at a time. So that one's kind of cool.
I remember when you pitched the look of the atlas, like having a 3D like landscape that's infinite in all directions, back when we were working on it. And like at the time I was so busy with other stuff in PoE1 that I didn't really like watch it develop day to day. But then one day I go downstairs and check in with you, and there's this insane 3D rendered like, you know, infinite atlas thing, and it's very cool what the team can do. I actually had a question about this. You'll have to indulge my technical question here, but okay. So in this, correct me if I'm wrong. In the new announcement, you have like an infinite ocean that's part of the atlas. So does that mean that there's just a portion where one direction is water and the other direction is land? Right. Like okay. So my memory is this stuff was being generated procedurally using like overlapping Perlin noise clouds or something like that. Okay.
So when you're generating a something that's infinite in size, you need to be able to have a way to generate each block independently of the other blocks. So you need some way of saying, okay, if I can like as I said, I can generate this. I don't have to know what was next door in order to be able to generate this. So that you can you know, like generate in any arbitrary location. So games like Minecraft and stuff work this way, right? Where you can kind of just say, like, you just for an arbitrary location on the map, okay, here's a place I'm going to generate. So overlapping noise is a really good way to do that. You effectively just take like a bunch of like trigonometry functions like sine and cosine and stuff, multiply them and add values, things like that, and then you get an overlapping one. You end up with like a kind of cloudy looking layer. And then in the case of a game like ours, which has biomes, you can kind of look at it kind of like different heights. Like if you imagine like that there's the mountain is like the mountain biome is like a height map, and then you've got like the plains biome as a height map. If you overlay them two on top of each other and you say, okay, wherever the plains are higher, there's going to be plains, and wherever the mountains are higher, it's going to be mountains. You can kind of like effectively imagine how you can get like kind of interesting shapes developing from that. So it's effectively just a bunch of overlapping noises where you pick whatever the highest one is. And so in the case of something like an ocean, where you want to have like, you don't want to have just like a flat border on the edge, but you still want to have it, you know, like blend into it with some interesting shapes. All you have to do is just say, okay, there's like there's a slow blend where we blend in the ocean biome from 0 to 1 over like a certain distance.
So it interpolates it in.
And effectively interpolates it in. But what that happens is, because all the other things have got like various heights, the ocean just becomes more prevalent until the point where it's the only thing that's there. So you get quite like a nice borderline, so long as you can sort of define where the edges in some sort of like fuzzy way like that. And so then you end up with an infinite ocean. But then on top of that, we wanted to have islands in the ocean. So then once you're in the ocean area, there's like a different set of random noises that overlap to create islands. And so I think there's I'm not 100% certain about the exact way, but there's like a thing that creates the island shapes, and I believe it uses the old noise functions for the biomes in order to generate the different shapes of the islands. But then what we do is, like, if it was forest, we instead make it a bunch of palm trees so that it looks like an ocean island. And if it was mountains, it'll instead be, you know, that have like snow and stuff on them. It'll instead be like a thing that looks more like the oceans and the water. So like, there's kind of like a set of alternate art variations, effectively, for the biomes that are on islands in the ocean. So
how do you control the distribution of the islands and making sure they don't collide with each other and stuff?
Well, they can, in which case you just get a big island. Like the island, we're not generating islands, we're just generating a noise function that happens to produce island-looking shapes.
So there's a sea level somewhere.
Yeah, effectively, you look at it as a sea level, yeah. But it's the same as you do the other thing, right? You just take whatever is the maximum value of two overlapping noise functions and tweak the parameters until it sort of looks about right.
Yeah. Okay, so the mechanic doesn't need a discrete island.
No, it doesn't. Right. So basically, the infinite ocean, there's effectively blocks that you explore. So you send out the ships, and then all of the you know, to a given block using a logbook, and then anything that's there will be explored. And then that will include, like, may include islands, may not, but it definitely includes at least maps that are like, I mean, so when I say islands, by the way, there are like islands that are like one map pin, which is like just like one map, and then there's larger islands that like have a structure to them that have like different biomes and stuff on them. So there'll always be at least, like, you know, various maps to do when you do one of these. But yeah, it's just kind of fun to like go from island to island. And we do a few things like you know, the distances between maps on the islands are like relatively small, but the distances on the ocean are quite large. So you get the feeling of traveling, like, you know, hopping around between island chains.
That's really cool. Yeah. No, I'm excited. So prior to me leaving GGG, one of the problems that we struggled with was like lack of executive bandwidth, if you see what I
Mm-hmm.
mean. There was me and you and Mark. Eric had left a couple of years earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and there wasn't enough time to do everything. Like, the PoE Mobile wasn't getting the attention it deserved internally and so on. And I solved this by making the problem way worse by leaving, but left you guys in a bad situation, obviously, with regard to, your time being further stretched. But how has it been going these days? Like, I hear that Mark has found people to, run an internal PoE1 team that he can supervise as opposed to having to work on it himself.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's like a lot of things of like company structure, but I would say that one of the things that is like a lot of this sort of company level stuff, you can honestly like not worry too much about it, and like most of it kind of goes away. Like I don't actually know that. Like, okay, so there are probably things that are getting left by the way, like by the wayside here, that probably mean that there's like various intangible benefits that we might have otherwise gotten are kind of being left by the wayside. Like I'm sure some of the like random deals you're doing and that kind of stuff like sort of probably mattered. But honestly, like I try to focus as much as I can on just the game development, like, and not really too much on the sort of company running stuff. And like there are people who like do operations and things like that. We can, that can handle things. But yeah, it's honestly not too bad. So I really try and focus on the game development as much as possible, and anything that's kind of not that, like that's not directly going to be responsible for making the game better, I try to just make sure that someone else is handling that.
I understand. So in the managing director / CEO position, you have decision-making authority, your responsibility, the direction of the company, but you don't want to be doing like pretend CEO job all day. You just want to make the decision and move back to the game.
For sure. So I mean, like I basically have like a sort of half an hour meeting every morning of like, here's the sort of company things that have come up. And I try to limit everything to that so that I'm not spending all day doing that kind of stuff. Because it would be really easy to just like spend a bunch of time on that stuff. And it's just the questions I don't know like how much value like you really get out of that. I mean, there's things that are important, right? Like we're deciding to do things like ExileCon, and there's a lot that needs to go on there. You need to hire people to work on that, and you need to do all this sorts of stuff. But as I said, I try to really focus on the game for the most part, because that's the part I actually enjoy. And I wouldn't want to like basically have my job be not that part too much, because otherwise, then I'd be wanting to leave, I suppose. Yeah, being able to do the fun part is, I suppose, the thing that actually keeps someone around and wanting to keep doing it. So yeah, as I say, I try to avoid the
ultimate threat. Someone brings you paperwork, and you're like, I can do this paperwork for you, but consider before you ask, because if I become unhappy, this all falls over.
Right. No. It's but yeah, that's why I just try to stick on the game. So I'm probably the part that I like the two things that I kind of work on the most, like in terms of the areas, is like the environment side, like making the new acts and areas, and also working on the new character classes. So like I'm doing a lot of that sort of forward-looking work. Whereas Mark tends to be doing the things like doing league work. I mean, I still work on the design. Like, I mean, the last league that we made, the temple one, I made the like simulation for that. So I'm still like even occasionally doing some coding. But a lot of the time, like because Mark usually does things like the monster design and boss design and stuff like that. So he's like often handling the kind of like that moment-to-moment gameplay stuff there.
So tell me about the simulation stuff, because I remember when we did the initial Incursion League, the first temple a long time ago, that started with us like, I may have just like, made a fake memory here, but we're like cutting up bits of paper and laying out a temple on the carpet on the ground. And like, we've got a board game version, as it were, of Incursion. And then you then coded that into a simple implementation that let us simulate it for like, you did a really good betrayal simulator. I remember that was actually like a power horse, that thing.
Actually, like, can't even remember that one.
A separate C++ implementation of Betrayal that you could run.
Yeah, I sort of vaguely maybe remember about that, but yeah, I mean, but look, doing that kind of stuff, doing the simulators is exactly the kind of stuff that I actually quite enjoy doing. So I did the same thing for Incursion as well, where effectively what I did is I just took one of our tools and just made like a thing where you can open a screen, which is just like, here's the effectively card game version of the temple. And doing that stuff is also good because you can there's a lot of things that you don't really appreciate whether the gameplay is going to be good until you've actually tried it. So there were just a lot of decisions that I thought I knew that I wanted it to work a certain way, and then when I actually tried it in the simulator, I realized immediately that it didn't. So and there was like a lot of things where we sort of eased up on a lot of the rules and like made it easier to connect things and that sort of stuff. And I don't think I would have done that if we had not been having the simulator early. Because a lot of that stuff, like if I was to just put a league like that straight into the game, like a sort of technical league like that, I think you really would like you'd be in the last few days and realizing, kind of like we did with Synthesis, that we needed to change the generation for it. Like Synthesis is an example of a game of a league where we didn't make a simulator for the sort of mechanics of it. And that meant that, like, because it all sort of has to come together before you can really play it, you then, realize that, okay, we actually have to change quite a lot about this. So, I mean, that's the reason why you do it. And really, everyone should do this, and everyone knows this. But then at the same time, it can be tough when you're staring down like a relatively fast league turnaround, and then actually budget time towards something like that. Because, like, it's easy to think, okay, we understand what we want this to be. We can just make this and hope that things come together. But it definitely isn't as good when we do that.
Yeah, I remember for Delve and Prophecy, I made these gigantic Excel spreadsheets where I'm losing a lot of geek points here, using Visual Basic for applications, which is what we script Excel with. It would implement the simulator kind of stuff, and every time you hit refresh, it would populate down it had a list of world areas for a run through the game with how much sulfite you'd collect in each one, how many delves it let you do, given the number of delves on average, how much progress you'd make. And then I'll let you say things like, okay, by maps, I'm at this depth, and therefore we can have it so that the catch-up mechanic went to that depth, minus 10% and so on. And yeah, as you're saying, it made it so much easier to have a separate thing to do that, because otherwise, if you're relying on the game version, it's ready, 3 days before release, and have fun balancing that.
Yeah. So you did the gameplay simulation of that thing, and then I think I did the actual generator for the map for that
which
one.
is like the Atlas one, right?
Yeah, the Atlas one. And that actually, it worked exactly like the Atlas one, actually. And that one came in handy because I ended up using the same thing for the card game at ExileCon, the last one.
Yes.
So it was kind of handy that I'd written that, because it meant that I could really easily take that and turn into that, which we ended up using.
Yeah. Speaking about ExileCon card games, do not confirm what's happening at this ExileCon, because I understand it has to be a surprise for all of us. And as an attendee rather than a host, I am looking forward to being surprised. But have you had time to do planning of what's happening with that kind of content?
So I do have an idea for what I'm doing with the card game, but I haven't started writing it yet. The card game is kind of one of those things that I sort of do in my spare time at home. So I'm not going to be sitting there at work doing that. And I haven't had as much time during the 050 cycle for this kind of thing. So after 050, my plan is to go and start, as my little hobby home project, get the card game sorted out. And there's lots of other ExileCon planning going on. And we've got broadly, we know there's things like the crafting benches and all that sort of stuff, and the map system and stuff like things like that we need. So there's space planned out at ExileCon for that, but the exact mechanics of the game in terms of what the league expansion is for it is not something that other people have know about yet.
There's this second layer to the card game design, which is to do with the availability of humans to run it, because obviously the staff love engaging with the players, right? It's a highlight, the fact they get to go and play the card game with players, but it's tiring. And, as we found out with the first one, if you stick a t-shirt on someone and hand them some cards and say, go engage with the players for 6 hours in a row,
well, that's why last time we made it so that people have 2-hour shifts of wearing the t-shirts rather than do that. So we'll do that again. Plus, we've got more staff now, so we can actually have a similar number of monsters for with half-time shifts. So that works out okay.
That's very cool. Yeah, it was. I mean, I don't want to be in that position again, because it is overwhelming to be that swarmed by people in my position. But it was one of the highlights of the last ExileCons, is getting to talk to players who. The people who were fighting me and you, as it were, because we had the highest t-shirts on, were people who had mastered the card game. They'd arrived with the goal of doing really well at the card game. And it helps that there were rumors that the someone was offering $2,000 for the card game prize. Remember those Mirror of Calandra pins? Anyway. So the people that came up to fight the card game against me were people that were so passionate about it, they'd made it their identity. There was this guy, lovely guy actually, he was at the Ultra VIP party, who had pre-arranged card game strategy to buy the starter decks that came in the backpack off people who didn't intend to play. He had some amount he was offering them, and I don't approve of the real money trading of cards to cheat at the event, but it did mean that he was able to get through the first couple of levels of the card game slightly faster and get to the monsters that weren't quite as swarmed as the other ones, and it was like a league launch.
Well, I can get you a t-shirt for the next ExileCon, Chris. You can at least go for some of the time. Get some
whatever you need me to do, Jonathan, just let me know. I'll be available. Yeah. When are you announcing obviously you'll still be working on it, but when do you plan to announce the schedule of what's happening at ExileCon?
Oh, it'll be a little bit later. I mean, we already talked about broadly what's going to be there, but in terms of the exact schedule, it's a little bit later, because we need to get all of the talks and everything from all that stuff written. And yeah, that's it. Probably
Nice.
a little bit after 050, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I had a question about the league design stuff we were just discussing. So
Hmm.
obviously, like you and I know how leagues used to work when we did
Hmm.
dozens of them for PoE1. But these days, is the process of making a league for PoE2 different than the way that we made it for PoE1? Bearing in mind like how PoE2 leagues get integrated into the end game, like are there any big differences there?
Not really, to be honest. It's pretty much the same stuff because at the end of the day, the formula that we worked out in terms of all the things you need to have in a league is still very much the case. You know, I would say the main difference is that the level of narrative complexity is higher than what we previously had in terms of
Yeah.
like the quality of the events you need to do and that kind of thing.
You want to have like a storyline that runs through it because you've got those the progress indicators now, right?
Yes, but it's not just that. It's kind of like, just the overall quality of what you're doing just needs to be higher in order to match with the rest of the game. So you can't really half-ass it in the way that like maybe we would have, like some years back. There's just quite a lot going on there, and that narrative stuff actually takes some of the largest amount of time because it requires a lot of different departments that are all moving together to create that stuff. And there's a lot of just like timing things and all sorts of stuff around that make it really hard.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the hardest things about 050 is because there's effectively the narrative content of 5 leagues in one release. Like there's so many of those narrative events, it just takes a really long time to get all that stuff working. And as I said, just one of the hardest things for whatever reason to actually to actually make good.
Early leagues in Path of Exile 1, like Anarchy, right?
Yeah.
There's a Rogue Exile, that's the league. Or Invasion, there's an extra monster that's hard to kill.
Mm-hmm.
They were quite simple, obviously, and it got more complicated as time went on. Budgets went up, quality standards went up, and so on. Do you think there'll be a situation later where these early PoE2 leagues seem really primitive and simple compared to the monstrosities you'll be producing in 5 years from now?
Well, it kind of already happened with the 010 leagues, but for a somewhat different reason, right? Because they were all made together. So I'd say what effectively, like a lot of what 050 is bringing all of those ones up to the standard that we've now effectively got for what a PoE2 league needs to be. I don't necessarily foresee them getting like too much larger, because like on some level there's a limit to what you can actually do in like a 4-month time period. I think it should honestly be like relatively similar. And like to be honest, like the PoE1 has also got that sort of level of stuff going on with a lot of its leagues. Especially things like Settlers. So like there's just a little bit of that coming on, just like the overall studio, like the kind of stuff, the kind of standards that we have as a studio are just higher now than they used to be too.
I wonder if you've got this process where you come up with a league idea, you make the simulator and you try the league idea out, which is a good opportunity. If you don't like it, you can fail at the simulator stage rather than once you've made the thing. Have you considered having like dedicated designers working on multiple leagues at a simulator level where all they're doing is getting approved ideas that then get made sequentially later? So now it's time to do League A and you implement that, but League B and C and D are being prototyped and iterated on at a simulator level in the background?
Well, I guess I got a few concerns about that. So one of them is that not every league is the kind of league that should have a simulator. Like Abyss is an example of a league that's just like, it's not like the mechanic isn't. I mean, there's balanced simulation in the sense of like, you need to work out like, what the right number of the holes is and like, how like stuff like that, right? Like there's things like that need to be done, but it's not like a simulator in the same way that Incursion would be.
Yeah, that one could be prototyped for fun testing.
I'd really say that only every other league is the kind of league that needs to do that, and that's probably a good thing because they attract different types of player bases. And the funny thing as well, by the way, is those sort of simulator type, heavy type leagues, a lot of them are actually less popular when they get first released, and then they sort of tend to be more beloved later.
Once they're understood.
I've noticed.
Yeah.
What was I going to say?
You had another point about simulator leagues.
Right. But the other thing as well is that it's really actually hard to make a league before you in advance, because so much of what you make needs to be a response to what the community cares about right now anyway. So like you wouldn't really be able to say like obviously there's things like you're going to need some uniques, right? You're going to need a pinnacle boss, you're going to need stuff like that. But like in terms of what the mechanics are and like what the game feels like it's missing, it's sort of hard to know about that in advance. So it honestly makes it a little bit hard to really to do that stuff in advance. The other thing as well that I think that is a bugbear that I think some game companies have is that, we put everything into our leagues. And what I mean by that is like, we don't come up with like, here's a plan for like the next like, years of content or whatever, and then like hold things back and kind of like, okay, here's when we're going to release this thing, whatever. It's like everything we come up with that's cool, we just do it immediately. And
Yeah.
like there's always more ideas that you can have, like if you can go back to the well and do it again. So I think that actually some game companies have run into problems where they like plan out this content schedule and then that's what they stick to, and then it's like they end up not really like not really adding enough and that kind of thing. Like part of the reason why our leagues feel full is because like, if we have an idea, we just want to do it immediately. And that does sort of lead to like a somewhat hectic schedule. But on the other hand, like you don't get this feeling of like missingness. And we actually almost made this mistake for 050. It's a little bit complicated to explain because like we kind of changed the plotline in order to not have this happen. But like we were going to have a situation where the boss that we were going to have was going to be one of like, it's like, oh, but like you haven't actually fought the true boss yet, kind of thing. And it's actually a really crappy ending. And I'm like, I actually don't want to be in a state, even if interstitially, where like you haven't fought the boss that is coming in the future. Like it's actually really bad. So
another large action RPG franchise that did that, I think.
Okay, I wasn't thinking of anyone in particular, but effectively, like I actually think it's really bad to leave people hanging on something like like you get them all prepared for something and then it doesn't happen. It's like really crappy. So as I said, we almost made that mistake in 050 and then we changed it. Like we had to change quite a lot of plotline stuff in order to make that better. Yeah, it's just, I think it's important that like you see the goal, you get to the goal. So like don't do something where it's like, oh, here's the series of like 4 bosses and then like you're going to fight one of them in this expansion and then you're going to fight the second one in the next expansion and that kind of stuff. Like you actually really want to, like if you're going to do it, then just do them all at once or don't do them, like, or don't even talk about the others or something, like it's okay to be like, here's one, and then like you don't know about the others at all, like they're not hinted at, they're not like a thing, but then later on there's more. But like don't really, I think it's just a really bad idea to make players feel like like I have to play later, I haven't even finished the story. Obviously, we're in early access, we haven't finished the story because the storyline's not done, which is sort of unfortunate. But at least we're not doing it wherever we can, wherever we don't need to.
Yeah. Your point about throwing everything into each release definitely resonates. I remember a number of years ago when we were still finding our cadence and so on, I had this pipe dream of getting a league ahead or getting half a league ahead, right? And we quickly ran into the issue that if you do that, you become out of touch with the Reddit will decide 2 weeks before a release what needs to be in that release. And if you don't have that, if you haven't been reading the tea leaves just right, beforehand, then you feel off base and out of touch. So, and then the other thing I remember you talking to me in detail about at the time was that if we have extra content, releasing it in this expansion and just making more extra content later is probably the best thing to do. And always valuing the today player rather than making our lives have an easier time later on.
Yeah.
I was trying to overproduce it, I think. And, the reality of what we did was the way you wanted, where we dumped everything in each expansion and they had more stuff as a result.
I mean, it's not like we can never produce things ahead, right? I mean, for example, like the acts that we're making, right? Obviously, a bunch of work has been done in the background to make that happen. But it's honestly not the way I like working. And it's like part of the reason why I think I find like working in early access stressful, because you've got multiple things on the go at the same time rather than being able to just throw everything into one thing. Like, there's a certain clarity you get just like being able to work on one thing. And so I honestly I just find these long pipelines to be quite stressful.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So I had a question. So early on, when we were discussing starting Path of Exile 2, one of our motivations for it was that we felt that because Path of Exile 1 was dozens and dozens of releases in, it was harder to get new players, right? Like jumping on a train that's been going for 10 plus years is difficult for some people. The game has a reputation for being complicated. And so Path of Exile 2 was an opportunity as an onboarding point. And so my question is about accessibility. And, I don't mean dumbing the game down or anything, but I just mean in terms of making sure that it's not, too complicated for new players. So you've got this tension where on one hand, you need to be a worthy sequel to Path of Exile. And that means for many people being more Path of Exile than Path of Exile is. But it's also a thing where if you are too, opaque and complicated for new players, obviously they'll bounce off it. How have you found trying to manage that? And do you think you've been successful at it?
Well, I think that my opinion is probably a little bit different from a lot of people, which is that I think that Path of Exile 1 being such an old game is in itself the accessibility problem that it has. What I mean by that is that this isn't to say that Path of Exile 1 isn't complicated. It is. I just don't think that the complexity is necessarily the reason why new players don't play it. I think the main reason why new players don't play it when they're not going to play it is like, well, this is a game that came out a decade ago. Like they feel like they've kind of missed the train. And so I don't think PoE 2 is necessarily... I mean, like, PoE 2 does have things that make it more accessible. but I wouldn't say that those were necessarily done because we're appealing to a different audience. It's more because we just thought that they were better designs that are just better in general for everybody who plays them. And I think the main reason why someone is going to play PoE 2 over PoE 1 is literally just because it's newer. Like, that is like a big factor for a lot of people, right? Like, there's just people who are like, okay, well, I never played PoE 1, I'm not going to get into it now. It's like really old. It's just the way a lot of people will see things, right? But hey, PoE 2, it's new getting on point. I can play it now. And like, I'm getting it on the ground floor and then I'm going to play it. And that's just going to make the audience bigger just from the purpose of, just from that alone. So I'm not like I'm looking at the, and I'm not looking and saying I want to appeal to a bigger audience. I'm looking at this and being like, this is a sequel that will appeal to a bigger audience who never, like, you know, because many people know about Path of Exile now, and the only reason they're not playing PoE 1 is just because it's old. So literally, it's like, even if we literally had appealed to exactly the same audience, I think we'd just have a bigger audience from that reason alone.
Good answer.
But yeah, as I said, like I don't say that to say that I don't want to make things more accessible, because I mean, it is good to make things better. It's just that I wouldn't be like I never want to be the person thinking I'm appealing to a different audience specifically, because I'm not. I'm just making the game better. And at the end of the day, the audience I'm appealing to really still is myself. You know, just whether I think things. So it's like things like the way the thing I use this example all the time, right? Like, the support gem system is just easier to deal with in PoE 2. But it's not like I wouldn't have done that in PoE 1, like, if I'd have thought of the way of that working back then, right? Like, it's just that, you know, we just didn't for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how well PoE succeeded despite having this system where if you're a new player, you have this really complicated thing where if I take my boots off, I can't cast Fireball anymore. Why is that? And if I'm a high-level player, if I take my armor off to put a better one on that I found, I have to spend a week getting the sockets and stuff perfect again, or however long it probably.
I don't think it takes a week, Chris. But
I have my mind back in the pre-301 era. No,
sure.
but you have to futz with sockets quite a bit in order to have it be equivalent. And it's one of those things where every player at every stage of the game has to understand, I need to be considering sockets with my items, which is, you know, something that's cleaned up really tidily in Path of Exile 2. I've been quite pleased with the progress of watching early access so far from my vantage point. I've been seeing really cool things about the game, so I wanted to say thank you for doing a great job with it. I think that what PoE 2 has grown into is far bigger than both games grew into far bigger than we imagined, but PoE 2 is such a unique identity of itself. You know, it could have easily been PoE 1 with better graphics and different sockets, but instead you've made something that feels like a very modern action RPG in a really good way.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're doing a good job. Well, thank you very much for having the chat with me today. It's been really interesting talking about this stuff, and I hope the viewers have found it fascinating as well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.